Hello and welcome to everyone on this, the first two lessons that are going to be dealing with the usage of the API objects in ASP pages. So we're looking at the way in which we can extend the interface of Sage CRM. And in this lesson we're going to have strong senses of deja vu because we're reaching the point where a lot of what we've covered already within the course in terms of understanding the role of the metadata in describing the universe to Sage CRM, and describing the databases, the database columns, the individual fields, for example, and how that can be used to speed up the generation of the interface. We'll be looking at some of those ideas. We'll also be taking the ideas of the scripting that we've seen that took place within the product, so the familiarity that we have with using JavaScript to create or work with data. And we'll be combining it with the work we were doing with scripting pages as well. So we're pulling in everything into the position where suddenly what we look at now within our ASP pages will look very, very familiar to us and seem perfectly reasonable. Well, in doing that, we are going to, in fact, look at creating the ASP pages, the extensions to Sage CRM, using a number of different ways. We'll look at how we build ASP pages that repeat some of the features of CRM. We'll look at the idea of a rebuild, a partial rebuild of a page, the idea of linking to new entities within the structure, so extending the data model, the idea of how we can connect to an external database and then draw information within that page. So we're going to look at three parallel approaches, but then look at how each of those are really very similar in their ideas, and we'll be understanding how to perform a number of distinct points. In fact, in this lesson we'll probably only get as far as listing out data within a basic page and then editing data. We will start to consider the idea of what's going to happen when it comes to the idea of complex pages. So by the end of the lesson, approaching in the last 20 minutes or so, we'll start to make our pages a little bit more complex and have a good think about how we can move to create new areas of CRM that look and behave very much like the standard behaviors that we see. But what we're going to do then is, first things first, is start the process of creating a page. And this is something of a reminder to you as to where we've been already within our pages. You can see there I was working on arrays there, but let's close that down and open up Visual Studio. And what I want to do is to create a brand new file. So I'm going to say File New, and I'm going to create this as a simple Hello World HTML page, or rather I'll create it as an ASP page first of all. It's just to remind ourselves as to how everything hangs together. Let's pull this Hello World, and if I save this is going to be, I'm going to put this down into let's call this into the CRM area. My install of CRM that I'm using is 7.3, so you can see where I'm going is to underneath CRM 7.3, underneath WW root, and into the custom pages. We know about the basic structures of where we install these files before, because of course we were doing that in an earlier lesson. And I'm going to call this file, I think, let's call this training.asp, and I'll save that. And so we've got a very simple page here. Well, my training.asp page can be called from the interface by going into administration, going into advanced customization, looking at the system menu, and I'm just going to put this into the user menu, and I'm going to call this training. And that action is the custom file, and it's of course calling training.asp, and I'll add that in place and I'll choose save. So if I run as another user, in this case, let's go and log on as Susan May. We can find that there's a tab training, and if I click on it, we get our hello world. So we've got the basic page in place, and we can start to develop this idea using the API. Now, in terms of the important thing that makes Sage CRM a very particular environment is that we make use of objects which are instantiated through the use of include files. This idea that we separate out a lot of our business that creates the objects that we want to use within the ASP page. Of course, it can go into the similar, we can just write it all as a continual ASP page, but the normal structure, if I go in saying and use an insert snippet here, is that our outline looks a little bit like this, where we would have our page referencing an include file and then whatever our JavaScript file is here, and I'm going to call one called training.js. And if I save that page again, I'm going to create another file, which in this case is going to be my JavaScript file, which I can then save as my training.js file. So I've got my ASP page including my JS file as an include file as well. We can see in our include files some very important points, and these we know about include files from the last lesson. If we look at these include files, we can see that there are lots of different potential include files, but the one that I'm interested in, or the two that I'm interested in, are the Sage CRM.js and the Sage CRM nolang.js. So if I pull those in and remind ourselves about these are all about instantiating objects which are important for our ability to access the COM objects. And in fact, the Sage CRM, we know, declares the language to be JavaScript, goes ahead and also includes the CRM nolang, which itself goes ahead and uses or sets up the idea of the object, the CRM object that our API uses. So this is the object that is meaningful to us, and everything really that we do is based on the usage of this object in the writing out of the page. So our code in here has to really make reference of that. And if we insert our snippet now, and I look at an insert onto this blank page, what I'm going to do is just use the idea of a basic outline for the page. And what we can see here is I've included quite a lot of JavaScript within the context of a try catch structure, the idea of error catching, with the exception handling to write things out. And you can see within the context of this I'm using CRM methods in order to instantiate objects which come from the COM API within Sage CRM that allow us to do a variety of different tasks, and in this case structure a response to be able to write out a nicely formatted error. Only in my case, if I go back into the product and of course refresh this page, there is no error, it's not doing anything, so it's just got a blank output. And what we have here, of course, is that try doing nothing. That's the idea of the include files. They allow us to access the API, but it doesn't do the work for us. We have to do the work, and there is one more thing really, is that if we are going to use the API, and we know around the role of the nolang file, we just need to be aware that there are some special versions of the developer files that are used by systems or useful within a context where you're developing extensions to Sage CRM that will then be run on CRM installs which lack the Enterprise Integration Server license. If I go as a system administrator into the system area and then into licenses, so down into where we've got our license key details, what we'll find in here in administration system license key details is that we can see that the license that I've got on my machine says that it has Enterprise Integration Server available to it. And that means it can go ahead and use standard include files very happily. Well, in the case of an install which and different areas around the world use this, where we've got around the world people not including extensibility license within the license sets, then as a development partner you can include these special include files to be able to deliver those in, and they will work. They're different because there's certain lines, the way in which the COM object is instantiated is slightly different. But when I was talking about revising ideas, the most important idea I want to revise with you is that it is metadata that does the heavy lifting. It is metadata that does the work within our pages. We find ourselves having to do very little code in order to have very deep and extensive effects inside our interface. It gets to the point where if we want to start to create an extension to CRM, if we want to remodel aspects, it becomes very easy. If I consider now a simple screen, and of course I do need to consider a simple screen just for the purposes of here in training, I'd like us to just think about the way in which opportunities can be listed out underneath the context of the user. Now, this particular screen is quite a complex screen because obviously we've got a pipeline graphic, we've got a summary box on the page, we also have a filter box on the page. But in essence, at its heart is this list, and creating a list is one of the tasks we're going to be looking at as we do this. And what I would like to do is do a partial rebuild to show how simple it is to create a list block that leans on the metadata definition. Now, in order to create a list within the system, we're going to understand, we're going to come face to face with the idea that there are a number of distinct things that we have to do within our code. We start with the metadata. So we have to first of all get the metadata definition for the list. So we actually have to what's called create a block. So that's create the object using the metadata definition for the list. We then have to get the context. These are the who are you, where are you. So these are the who, what, where questions that we have to answer. So it's where am I within the context of our conversation, basically maintaining the state of the web transaction. We then have to link the context to the data. So that will essentially be the idea of a where clause or an argument. So where are you within the context of our work? So within all of this, the next thing that we have to do is to generate. We have to generate the HTML, and we have to return the HTML to the browser. But our starting point is always going to be this idea of getting hold of the list, the core definition of the object. Now, in our case, as a system administrator, I can go off to look at customization for the opportunity. If I look at the opportunity, we can see that there are a number of distinct lists already in place, and I can reuse this block definition. So I've just come in here, and you can see that what we do is we find that there's a name useful for ASP pages. That's the opportunity list. So back inside my code, I can start to construct what would be necessary. So I can insert a snippet here within my code snippets, within the Sage CRM, within ASP. I look down here, and what I will find is that I've got the idea of get block. So I've got the idea of get block. I'll leave the block being called my block, but the block name is going to be my opportunity list. The next thing that I need to do is to get hold of the context. And we know how to get hold of context. We've been using this a lot in the environments that we've been coding so far, and that's the get context information. So in here I can say in my code snippets, Sage CRM within ASP pages, the idea of get context is very important. So we've got a choice. We've got the idea of the user or the selected user. This, by the way, is quite an interesting idea, because if we're pulling up information on a page, I might change the user. I could move over to work with the selected user, but I'll stick with the idea in my code of just the straightforward user object. My code snippets, Sage CRM ASP, and I look down in here at what I've got, which is my user information. So I'm getting hold of the user information. And the next thing that I have to do is to start to build the argument clause. So in here, how is a user related to opportunities? Well, it's through the oppo assigned user ID field. And so I can start to think within the code snippets of writing that. Now, of course, you'll get to a point where you won't need to use the snippets. You'll just know how to construct this. So it'll know that you'll be able to just write var arg equals and then the assigned user ID. So, and in fact, the argument can be called anything you like. But that's essentially the where clause that we want to use. And the next thing, if we've got our definition of a list object being returned, so that my block is my list object, and we have a way that the argument, the where clause, would limit the rows returned by this, we can then think about executing the block to generate the HTML, but in such a way as restricting the returned data. Every object that generates an interface within Sage CRM has something called a fundamental method, and that is the execute method within Sage CRM. This execute method basically says, go do the voodoo that you do so well. Go away and build the HTML for me. And in the case of my code snippets, we can see that this is the idea of the generate the HTML. And we've got the two methods, the alternative method and the preferred method. The alternative method is really only used in very particular circumstances. The preferred method is the one that you and I should be using just about all the time. But you can see here the way in which we write this out is that my block is executed, and in this case we're passing in the argument string that will limit the data returned. So the execute method passes the where clause to the list block, which then knows not to return every item of data, but it knows how to generate the HTML. Now this then returns HTML, which is added into the content of the page, which then the page is generated by using the idea of the get page, and you'll see that at this point with the response right, we're writing using the standard ASP method to return it to the screen. Well, let's get rid of some of the unnecessary comments, and what we'll find is that those 5 lines correspond to the 5 comments that I gave earlier on. And we'll see that as we look at the training here, this is returning and showing exactly those opportunities. Now, the two opportunities, of course, these pages are slightly different because it says 7 opportunities there, but don't forget that this is filtered by in progress, whereas this look at my training tab here is that it is including won and lost data as well as just include as in progress. And as I said, this is a very simple thing. But that simple idea is emphasizing the point that we're using metadata, the metadata definition of the list, in order to build a very complex HTML-rich screen. And it is complex because this orders, it's got the ability, I can reorder my columns. If I had hyperlinks, you can see I've got hyperlinks. I can go off and jump across to the details of the opportunity or to the details of the company or person, for example. And I could have, and you can see that it's also got some aspects of tooltip behavior as well. Well, this behavior all defined in the context of the metadata, and we can take this idea when we want to work with either an external database or a new entity constructed inside the system. Now, before I go through the process of creating to an external database, I just want to remind you or look at something that we will look at in more detail when we come on to components, and that is the idea of, sorry, I went into the wrong place there. The thing that I want to go into is into the customization and come down into the component manager area. And within the component manager area, I want to use my advanced customization wizard. Now you can see I've got lots of components available for me to use within my training install. The advanced customization wizard can be will be something that we'll cover in more detail, the installation of these, but the advanced customization wizard is the tool responsible for allowing us to create new entities very, very quickly inside CRM. And here I'm going to create a new entity called project. So it's going to have a prefix of proj. I will link it into my CRM, so a user is going to be assigned to it. It's going to be able to find those. I want to be able to link it to a team as well. We'll say that it's owned by companies and people, so a bit like a case in that regards. It doesn't have any relationship directly with opportunities. Well, actually it will. Let's say we sell we can sell a project, so it will be owned by that project, and we can say that it's going to have cases. So it has cases underneath it, as well as communications and a library. So people will be storing documents about this project, and they'll also want to be able to write letters and faxes, etc., about this, and we'll not have any direct relationship to the orders and quotes, but we will have within here the idea of our workflow and workflow progress. And I think once I've done everything there, I can choose to install my component. My component installs. The longest aspect that we see about the installation process of the component is within the refreshing of views and metadata. That always is the item that takes the time as the views are rebuilt, and then everything is refreshed within metadata. Once it's done, as you can see that it's done here, I can come into continue, and we should have now underneath the My CRM, you can see that there's a project option. If I go off to look at a company, you should see that in here that over on the right hand side in the context of the company I've got a project option as well. That's something that the system administrator can see. If I go into a company as a salesperson like Susan May, what we'll find is that I don't see the project information. The project information is invisible to me, and this is because when we created this new entity, we created it as a full system entity, and more than that, we actually created it as a primary entity. And so we can see here down here, its project is created. And we've got all these different metadata definitions of the fields, etc. And there are screens and there are lists that have been created, as well as supporting ASP pages. But we don't see those yet, because if I go into where we've got our users area and look at security, we will find within the security profiles that nobody here has got access to the project entity. So there's no access. If I edit this, I can start to say that people have got edit and insert rights on these. Hurry up with my checking. Once I've done that, I can choose save. And what can I next do? I can then what can I next do? I can go back as my user here and refresh my company page, and we should see project appears over on the right hand side, and I can now start. I've got the rights to be able to use this. And importantly, what we can see is that I'm now using an ASP page. And so we have an ASP page environment that automatically built for us. And it's very simple, this idea of constructing our new entity. But where these options are, this project and project summary page, and if I look up to the company, this navigation is also something that needs to be considered around a new entity. These we'll see in a moment the creation to the external database. But any new entity that is created has to be modeled within inside the database, and certain fields are necessary in order to be able to do certain things. So we'll see in a moment that we can create a new entity or a link to an entity outside of CRM, but that new structure external to CRM won't work in the same way when it comes to workflow. You can't workflow an external entity. It won't work in the same way as security because, well, there is no security field, and it won't work in the same way when it comes to the idea of even deleting the information and timestamping information, because those fields just aren't present. And the table that I want to connect to and then start the process of creating the equivalent lookup is actually within the database Panoply Tech, and we look here within the database and you can see that I've got a table called contacts. So I want to be able to create a link to that external database table within that external database. This is easy enough to do. As a system administrator, I know that just about anything within the world is modeled within metadata, and that is the advantage that I've got. I can come in here, as you can see, into administration. I'll go into customization, and before I go into customization I should go into advanced customization, because I've got the option to come down into tables and databases. It's within here, within the metadata screens, definition screens, I can start to explain how Sage CRM can create a link to a particular database server, to a particular database, in this case called Panoply Tech. If it was within the context of a DMZ, I could put in the port number that I'm using, but it's not, so it's very easy to be able to just put that in, and then I can also put in the appropriate password for the database that I'm connecting with. It doesn't have to be the SA partner password. It can be any user that has rights to be able to access those tables on the basis of what you want to do with those tables. If you just want to view, it just needs to have view rights. If you want to be able to insert, update and delete, well, you need to have the corresponding rights for that particular user. And here I've got my Panoply Tech database, and if I look inside my database now, so if I use the database that I'm working on and then go off to the idea of select star from custom underscore databases, we can see here that our connection through to the Panoply Tech database was defined within the database. In fact, you can see it here within this particular screen, and the database connections are all opened up as Sage CRM starts, and so they're immediately available. I can run any questions that I like straight away once CRM has started up against this database. But I also need to model one of those tables, and the table that I'm interested in is this table contacts. And if I call this contacts as the physical table name, I'm also going to give it a more distinct name so I can easily recognize it, and I'm going to call this Panoply Contacts, and it's within this Panoply Tech database. And I need to call the name of the field that I want to use to identify it, like which field is the primary key, and I happen to know that that's company ID. If we have a look at the columns, we can see that primary key is in fact company ID in this external database. So I've chosen this information, and now I can choose save. Excuse me. Let's see if anyone's got any questions so far. I would imagine that things are going pretty easily, and this is a bit of a revision so far, but remember, we're trying to bring things together, ideas together. Shani, you were asking about, do we have to have full descriptions of the database columns within inside the CRM database? Well, the answer is no, you don't, because we know if we go into customization now and look down, not at a primary entity, but this time as a secondary entity, we will see that we have our Panoply Contacts database in here, and we know that there's no description of these fields within inside the metadata table. At the moment, we've got a description for the database, and if I say I want to look for the custom tables, there will be an entry that describes the tables, but the fields are not described. But that doesn't stop us using them, but it's just not described. And we can see here our Panoply contact has now got a nice description within it. And it, with the database ID, points out that it actually belongs to an external table. So what am I going to do? I want to create the equivalent of the My CRM training page here for my external database table. I want to get to this point where I've got the same type of rolling out of information. And to do that, we have to start to move towards thinking about, well, in this case, we need to fill in some more descriptions of fields. We also need to think about how we move around. If we want to bring information into CRM, we have to think about the screen flow. So where do the pages that we create hang? Are we just going to plan this? We are going to plan this from the beginning, or do we just going to ad hoc add things in? In the case of the new entity that we added, the project, all of these different entry points were added as the new entity was taken. But in fact, there's dozens of places that we have to consider. Where do we use the new screens? Where do we use those new structures? And there's lots of tasks that need to be carried out when we're creating a new structure. And it doesn't matter whether this is a structure like our it doesn't matter whether it's a structure like our new entity project, or whether it is a new structure like the table that sits outside of CRM, or in fact a rebuild of some of the screens within inside Sage CRM. You still need to go through and have a convention about what you're going to do. So for example, I'm now starting to work around a particular new entity which belongs to the Panoply Tech database. So I think that one of the conventions that I'm going to use is I'm going to call this all the time. I'm going to say Panoply Tech something, and the convention I'm going to use is that it's going to be Panoply Tech something like contacts, and I want to, if I'm performing a list, then it's going to be Panoply Contacts list. So you can see that there's a very definite set of patterns that I'll follow. My naming convention is also going to be used because I want to group the work together. So where I switch into looking at the information within inside my install, here you can see I've come down into CHCRM 7.3, into WW root. Now I'm coming down into custom pages. I can create a brand new folder in here that I'm going to call Panoply Tech. So in here I create Panoply Tech, which is the name of the database. So I'm going to build and put all my work in one location. And the first thing that I want to do, if you've got the idea of the naming conventions, and the naming conventions, by the way, won't just be on the ASP pages, but we will be following a convention for the objects that we create as well, the metadata structures that we define. And we've got a number of tasks that we need to do. Now, I've already started one of the tasks because I've created a list page, but there are others that we need to work towards, like lists and inserts and edits and searches and dealing with these tasks. Now, we'll look here essentially at listing and then editing pages, and then we'll move towards the idea of a complex screen. Our list page structure, though, is essentially one of the simplest that we can have, where we have just a list being obtained, the context being obtained, tying the list to the context, and then executing the structure to generate the HTML that is then returned into the browser. Well, do we do the same thing with our database out here, this contacts database? Well, if we look through the fields, we can see that there's no link to the user context, so that's not going to be useful to us. We're not going to do that, but we can nonetheless create a list of information held in that database. And that's really quite simple. What I'm going to do inside Sage CRM is I am now going to create a list block. So I've created a list block, and I'm going to create a new Panoply contacts list. So here's Panoply contacts list, and it's going to come from, now the table it has to come from is the physical table to which we're joining, which in my case is called contacts. That's the physical table, not just the alias name that we've defined it inside CRM. So there's Panoply contacts list, and I can add in a couple of fields to prove the point. And the fields that I think I want to bring in are going to be the company name, the contact name, and I think we'll also bring in, the idea of the type, email, and I'll also bring in the web page. Now they're just 3 fields in here. We see that we can actually add in other properties into those fields, like order by, for example. Let's choose contact name to allow order by. And if I update that and choose save, that will be one of the items that we will see when this list is built. Contact list, when I first design it, will look a bit strange because we haven't as yet overridden or provided any field definitions. But we do have the columns that are included within the list. But by field description, I mean we haven't changed the titles, and we haven't hard-coded anything into, or we haven't added any property descriptions into what are called the custom edits table. So there's no any caption that we've got for these will be the default, but they're not the we don't have the corresponding translations or entry descriptions for the fields, but we'll come on to that in a second. What I want to do is make some progress, and I want to move towards the idea of creating this list page. So in our structures here, I am going to create a new file. I'm going to cheat here. I'm going to save this as, and I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call this training. So I'm going to create this as a new folder, call it training, and in training I'm going to put in now the idea of the Panoply contacts, and we're in the context of the user, so I'll call this user list dot ASP, or actually yes, I'll leave it as Panoply Contacts User List. And if I save that, and we can also save the associated JavaScript file. If I next create another file, this time a JavaScript file, I can create this as my associated Panoply Contacts Users List page. And I need to save it down into training, which it's going into. So Panoply Contacts User List. Oh, and that's wrong. So let's get the spelling right. It's one of those things that can catch you out. So I've got my contacts list. I just need to make sure that my file is correct. I've got 2 mistakes now in my page. I've got 2 mistakes in my page now, and we'll see what they look like when I include a reference to that. So Panoply Contacts List is what I'm calling. Now I want to go into advanced customization and create this call to this file. So I'm going to think about the first place that I'm going to add this into the user area, and I'm going to say that this is my Panoply Contacts List. It's not a particularly nice name there, so I'll just call that Panoply Contacts. The custom file is to call Panoply Contacts List, and what we will need to know is that we need to put it down into the training folder. So it's into training folder Panoply Contacts List.asp. And if I choose to add this, and I'm going to move it up next to contacts in here and choose save. We've now added it into our user menu. And if I go and look at my CRM, let's refresh this, we can see that there is the Panoply Contacts available to us. Now if I click on it, this is where we're going to see we've got some errors occurring. We've got Panoply Contacts List is what it thinks that the ASP page is, and it's actually Panoply Contacts Users List, user list. So it's a wrong name. 404 is the first error that we find when we're doing our typically work within ASP pages, and it's the friendliest, nicest error message. It's the most obvious thing to look at. You check the path, you check the file name that you're calling, that's what it expects to be there. So Panoply Contacts List, that just needs to be changed to Panoply Contacts Users List. So if I look now in here, we change the Panoply Contacts to Panoply Contacts Users Lists, update, choose save, and we'll know that we'll making progress because the error message will change. So we now change from a 404, I should have changed from a 404. Oh, actually we need to refresh the page again. If I look at my Panoply Contacts, we still have a 404, but we're called, did I not change that? Contact user list, did I not refresh that? I think I need to refresh this. My menu had not refreshed, and then I go back into my Panoply Contacts, and we now have Panoply Contacts Users Lists in training, and something's wrong with this. Panoply Contacts User list their users list. See, it's all very, very precise. That has to be user list, not users lists. Update, choose save. And so now if I run back and refresh this page so that the menu redraws, and I try and go down into Panoply Contacts, we can see that progress genuinely has been made because the error message changes. Sorry, that's the cynical nature of my life, that I know I'm making progress because the error message changes. And what we see is a very common thing, is that we are referencing an include file which is not found. And that again is down to what we are including here. Conts user list contacts user list.asp is not referenced within the page, and custom pages training ASP is not found either. We can see in here this first line is referring to that file. It's not found because as we look at the contents of our folder or in training, we can see that there is no eware file, there's no include files, there's no sagecrm.js. None of the include files are here. Our include files are in the directory above. So what we can do is just change the path to a relative path to look up. If I save that, again we'll see that the error message changes, so further progress is being made. So if I refresh this, we can now see that the include file panoply conts user list.js was not found. So that's telling us this is incorrect. And if I just change that to contacts user list and then refresh, what we can see is we've got the blank page. That's correct, because at the moment, if we look at that contacts user list file, there's nothing there. So it is, everything is working now to the best of its ability, which is doing nothing. But there's no error messages, and that means that we've got to a point where we can now construct our list. So how do we construct the list for our new entity? Let's remember what we've got here. We've got inside our page, so if I run down, so I'm looking at now my Panoply contacts, we need to have a list block to reference. We've got Panoply contacts list. If you look at this, we can see that we've got this, so let's go and invoke this. The Panoply contacts list. In the code, we right mouse click, insert snippets, my code snippets, Sage CRM. I look at the ASP page and I run down to find the basic file structure, which we've got here. We then need to go and retrieve the block from metadata. So the same idea, my code snippet, Sage CRM, ASP, and I do a get block, and the block is called Panoply contacts list. Once I've done my Panoply contacts list, I can then think about the argument. But in this case, this is what I was saying earlier on, is that there is no argument to tie us between the My CRM menu and the information held inside this database table. So in this particular instance, I'm not going to have to worry about the argument. I can just go ahead and use the block without restriction, and it will return all records. So I'm going to insert snippet, my code snippet, Sage CRM, and what I can do is within the ASP page, as I look down here, I'm going to choose the idea of generating the HTML, the preferred method. This time the block doesn't have an argument, so I can remove it, and all we've got are these two lines, one that is responsible for generating the HTML of the inquiry and running the query and generating that, and the other line, as you can see here, is returning this to the browser. So I've got 3 lines of code in total that now, if I refresh this, what we can see is that it has in fact used those 3 lines to allow us to query the external database. This is coming live from the database and build the rest of the information on the screen. Now let's see, does anyone have any questions about what I've done? So you've got a question here. I'm trying to create an ASP page. It should have a list table. The list should have 8 columns, 4 only. Oh, I see. The data is combined between. Yes and no. I wouldn't do that. It's a little bit more complex than that, Ashani, because when you're writing out the record block within inside the COM API writes out the structures which include the navigational elements, as you can see here that I'm just demonstrating. And so if you were to have 2 blocks with columns, and these buttons don't expect more than 1 instance of that page, 1 instance of that structure to be available on the page. There are ways around it, and the community does talk about how you can embed multiple lists within the same page, but you're essentially going to use an iframe to get around that. One of the things that I did in preparation for this class is that I collected many of the things I've written recently, and you can see that there's a roundup of articles about creating ASP pages, and so something of a guide in here. And one of the articles that we should have within the more advanced topics in creating this is that there should be examples of creating a multiple list blocks using the COM ASP API. So there's an article in here, as you can see. I'm not sure if this will come out particularly well, where you can have multiple blocks on the same page. And you could decide whether or not you wanted to include the columns. Now obviously this is reporting to separate bits of information, but you could actually be reporting to snapshots of similar information with the same column names, structured in the same widths, etc. Okay, I hope that that's sensible, made a little bit of to understand what we've done. We so far have now managed to create a list page, and I hope that you understand that, or if you can agree with me, that it's actually very easy to do that because it's the metadata that is doing most of the work, and then the API generates out the interface, and we don't have to worry too much about the navigation of blocks, etc. The next thing that I want to do is to look at the edit page structure, and this is actually just about the last official thing that we're going to do, but I'm going to do it simply, then add some features to it, and then start thinking about how to make it a little bit more complex, the idea of a multi-page structure. Because what I'd like to do is think about the way in which we would perhaps look at a listing of opportunities. Oops, there we go. I've got a slight error there. Let's look back at our listing of opportunities. If I go down into looking at opportunities and where I actually created within the training page the listing of the opportunities that we've got, the simple one, if we go into an opportunity, we can see that we have got a number of different distinct areas within inside this page, including starting to address the top content, starting to have the idea of multiple sections to the page, and the idea that we can have, as you can see here, coaching captions displayed as well. So I want to move so that we can look more like this page, and what we can do to do that. Well, if we're going to do it, then we need to think about how we build the hyperlink for our list, and that's going to be done within the administration screens, and we have to change this list to add in the hyperlink capabilities. Now, if we're going to do this, we might as well format these fields correctly as well, because some hyperlinks are not just things that we add in; they come free, if you like, with the behavior of the system. For example, if we change the email field, so it's not a text field but is instead to be an email address, we will find that it will start to behave very much like a CRM field. So I've changed that to be an email field, and if I look at this web page and change this, I can change this to being the idea of a www URL, and I can say that this is the web page, and changing the captions as well. So this is where translations are going into the field. I can also change some of the others, like company name, for example, here. Choose company name, and I'll choose as well contact name as well. So contact name gets entered in. I save that. Now if I load up, and I load up as Susan May, and I click on here the idea of the panoply contacts, we will see that inside our I didn't mean Susan May. So the Susan May didn't get that because of the translation issue. She is in fact using a different language to the system administrator. But if I do it as Kylie Ward and come down here, you can see that that's actually done. So we can see the company name, contact name, email and web page have had their columns retitled, and you can see as well that we have got some nice features in the sense that if I click on the web page, it opens up and tries to get to that particular URL. I don't think that exists. And we can see that we could click on here and we could start the process of writing an email as well. Now, of course, the to address is good, and we can put in copies to other people as well, which is all nice and good, but they don't. That, when the email is sent out, would only be stored against the it would only be stored against the user. It wouldn't be stored against this record, because there's no linkage between the communication and the emails to this. And you can see there it's managed to jump across over to this particular website. That was very strange. That is, in fact, there is a Ramoroi Tomio is actually a domain that seems to be known. Ramiro Tomio. Well, that is nice, but let's actually get the status built. So if we are going to add in another hyperlink in here, we need to jump across to a new page, and so I'm going to use a hyperlink on the field within this column, and I'm going to use the idea of a custom jump. The custom jump allows us to specify the the file that we're going to, and that's going to be stored in the training folder. And a bit like where we've got in here the name defined, Panoply contacts user list, this is going to be Panoply contacts summary. So I choose that, and the custom ID field is going to be the field that contains the name of the contact. Well, what should we have? The custom ID field is going to be the ID field for this table in here, which is company ID. So company ID is what we need to enter in here. I'll update that field and then we can save it. Now, obviously, I haven't got that written yet, so if I refresh this page where we can see these links and I click on this, we will discover that we get the friendly 404 error message. And now if I switch across into my screens here, this is where we can start to build that particular page. Now my page in here, which is Canopy Contacts, I can save as and quickly create myself the necessary Panoply Contacts summary.asp, and I can expect to find my summary.js file. So this should now disappear as an error message, and we get an include file not found, which is fine. We know what that is because we've met that before. So line 2, it's looking for an include file which isn't there, and what do you know, it isn't there. We'll need to create for ourselves a new include file, which is a Panoply Contact Summary. So I just need to give this a name, and this should be now, if I refresh this, you can see it goes. There's no error message because the file is just not doing anything. So it is this file that is the business that we need to add in our outline and decide what it is that we're going to create. So that's our basic structure. Now when it's looking at a summary page, what we have to do is similar to when we did our list page. There's about 4 or 5 steps that we have to do. Always the first one is to say get the screen or the list from metadata. So get the screen from metadata. That's always going to be the first thing that you want to do. And then you have to answer the where are we question, which is the get the context info. Now we know about get context in the context of the listing of the opportunities. We knew that we were in the context of the user, and so we could use get context info. This time it's going to be different because what we're doing is we're jumping across to an ASP page, passing across we're not interested in what company we're in, what user we're in. We're interested in which contact ID, not a CRM contact, but the external information. So we're looking at information that comes from the URL, not just from the context within inside CRM itself. So we'll have to face that. That's a slightly different question of doing that. But once we've done that, we can then get the record that matches the context. And then the next thing we have to do is add the record to the screen and generate the HTML. We have to then send the HTML to the browser. And into here as well, we can add in another comment which will be a question really. How will editing and displaying the data work? Okay. Getting the screen from metadata is Very simple. We know about this. This is the idea of the get block. So I come into my insert snippets, into my code snippets, Sage CRM ASP, and I look at get block. The block that I need to go and get has to be defined within inside CRM. So I come down into my screens and I need to create for myself now a new screen. Here I just want to be able to get hold of the contact info. So let's have a look at calling this Panoply contacts. Let's call it the detail box there. And we'll do the same, Panoply contacts detail box, and I'll save that. Inside here I'll add in 3 fields. I will choose to add in my contact name, I'll add in the contact title, and I'll add in the company name. And I think when I add the company name, I'll put this onto a new line, so I can then add in as well the company type or the contact type, and I'll add that in place, but I want that to go in as the same line, choose save. So I've basically got 2 lines of information there: contact name, contact title, company name and type. And just for neatness sake, while I've saved that, once that's saved, I will add in, I think I'll just improve the display of the idea of the contact name, contact title. So I do that within the fields. The contact title just can be improved, and we'll call this title, I think. And in the case of the type, it just needs to be called type as well, so it's a little bit nicer as to what we do. So there's our type, and we have a screen. So back inside here, we're going to retrieve as our block the idea of the Panoply contacts detail box. And then the next thing that we need to do is to get hold of the context info. Now the context info is all about reading the URL that we see here, and the particular bit that we want to read is this company ID. Now you'll know from the last lesson the idea that we can use the query string to do this, to retrieve that information, because it's not a system table, it's not a core table, we can't use get context, but instead we can in here get hold of context using the idea of the query string. Now it looks a bit peculiar what I've written out here, because in this particular instance where we've got getting the opportunity ID, you'll notice that I've got a lot of code which seems to be handling arrays and splitting arrays, and this is just a little bit of code that we use to make sure that we handle the idea that this variable could end up in a complex page being mentioned multiple times within inside a query string. It could be found itself as we're moving backwards and forwards, we could end up building it multiple places. But I'm going to leave it like this, very simple idea, made a little bit more complex than perhaps you might want, but it actually does the trick in making it easy for us. So here we've got getting company ID, writing it out into a field, into a variable here, ultimately called the int record ID. So now what do? We have to retrieve the record that matches the context, of course, which is our int record ID, and there we're using find record ID. So I need to go into my code snippets, Sage CRM ASP, and look down to the idea of using the using the idea of find record. So right towards the end, we've got the record object, and we want find using context. And you can see the way in which we would do this is to see what record we're creating, and it's coming from contacts, and it's the int record ID, but the field is company ID. And so that will give us the record back that we want. So we know about find record because of our usage within inside workflow and inside the table level scripts. So this is, again, shouldn't be scary to us. And what I was saying earlier on is that we need to take that record and add it to the screen. Well, here we already know how we can add this to the screen because of the idea of passing the argument of to the execute method of the block. It's the same idea here, although it's a different object. It's the same fundamental method, the execute method. So in here, I look at my ASP object, run down, and we find that we've got our generate this, and you'll notice that instead of passing in the argument string, we'll pass in my record, and there that will generate the page for us. So let's save this and refresh this page, and what we should see is suddenly we now have a screen that's starting to look well, it's real. It's actually a real page that is working, and you can see this answers the last question I had, which is how do the idea of editing work? And you'll find that the blocks take care of it for themselves. We don't have to worry about that. It's handling what's called the mode, and it's redrawing the screen in edit mode or in view mode as we're looking at the information. In tomorrow's lesson, we'll actually go a little bit further than this because we'll start discussing the idea of handling deletes and handling inserts, and so we'll be seeing that it's not just a question of am I in edit mode and am I in view mode. There's such things as post, save and pre-delete and post-delete screens that we also need to think about. But this is good for now. We see the idea of our screen, but it's still not quite right. It doesn't look as nice as it could be. We could start to improve things, because in here we might want to say, well, can't we in our code have a title to the block? Because if we look at a screen where we've got opportunities and I go into an opportunity or a case, you can see, let's see, here I haven't got any of those, which is a bit of a blow. I've gone into team, into opportunities. Here, if I go in and look at this, we can see that we've got titles for the different sections. So I need to add in a title just here so it's a little bit better laid out. I can think as well that I would like to display the correct menu, and I might want to start to display the top content information that I want it to be, and I might also want to change and include some coaching captions within the page. Let's do first things first. If we go and think about captions and translations, we can go into, as a system administrator, and go into look at the administration screens, look at customizations, and if I look at translations, we can see what suitable tabs can be used. Now, I happen to know that a very useful labeling mechanism is a caption family called tab names. So if I have a look at tab names as the caption family, tab names, and look down here, you'll see that there are lots of very plain, simple tab names that we can use. And in fact, if we look at one of the translations as this, as company, and find this, we can see that tab names, we've got lots of very useful tab labels that we could use. So this is a very nice thing that we can actually put in here and call this tab names just company or company people or company summary. I think that might be quite a nice thing to use, and what I will do in here now is introduce the idea of a structure like a block having properties. Now this is drawn from the fact that I know these blocks have properties are drawn from the developer guide. Now the developer guide lists out the different items, and you can find the developer guide on the community. And if you look currently, it's being updated as we speak, the developer guide, but if I have a look at developer guide, I can't spell, 7.3, developer guide 7.3, you'll find, or 7.x even, you'll see that there's a developer guide available to us that if I download, in this case, in my case, it's download again because I've got quite a few versions of this downloaded now, but if I download this and open it up, what we'll see is that there's a section in here where it goes through the different properties of the blocks, and what we want to do is come to the section in which is describing the ASP object reference, and you can start to see all of these different objects, and the particular object would be something like the CRM objects and methods and properties, and you can start to see you've got different modes in here, and I want the CRM block, and you can see that there's a property here that starts to describe all of the different structures. So this is something that you can look to, and in my case, if I switch back into here, there's into my code, the particular property that I want to use is the idea of the title. So if I say block title, I can say now crm.getTrans, and we use getTrans in some of our discussions of the earlier places where we can enter JavaScript. And so here we've got CRM getTrans and tab names is my caption family, company summary is the caption that I want to use, and there now I should be able to look at my screen, looking back to my CRM, look at the idea of the panoply contacts, and if I drill down into this, we can now see company summary, a very nice little label for this. We can also improve this again through a translation trick, which is really using the concept of the inline coaching captions. So if I use inline coaching caption and go off to look at my CRM at these panoply contacts and then go to the same screen, you can see I can click here and add or edit the coaching text. So on this screen I can add in any information that I might like, which is to say this screen provides a summary of the contact information held in the external database. And once I've written what I wanted to do, I can save that back in. There's my coaching caption. I just need to return as the system administrator back into that administration screen and turn that off. Me as a user though, in the external system, if I refresh this, what we'll see is that we now have the coaching captions displayed. So it's starting to look very much like a screen within inside CRM that doesn't actually look any different really from a core screen. Now, there's two more things I want to do before we finish the formal teaching and set up and see whether you've got any particular questions. The next thing to look at is the fact that it's not changed the menus along here, the tab menu. And so that's something that I can do by going back into customization, looking at the secondary entity again, which of course is our Panoply contacts, and creating in here a tab group. So I create a new tab group, which I'm going to call Panoply contacts. And within the Panoply contacts, I'm going to create a tab called Summary, which is a standard label, call custom file, which is going to reference the training file, which in turn is going to call our Panoply contact summary.asp page. So I do that and I add that and I choose save. Now that I've got this tab group called Panoply Contacts, I can alter my code. So where we have got the page being written out, one of the things that we can see is that we can specify a tab group to be used. And in that case, I want to specify that we're using Panoply Contacts. So if I save this and now refresh my page over here as Kylie Ward, what we'll see is that we now have summary displayed here. The next thing I want to do within the pattern of the page as well is to remind ourselves that this has written out a lot of information within the screen, more than simply we had asked it to. In fact, automatically, if we look at the page source, we can see that it's included a very large amount of includes of structures and all sorts of cleverness within this page. And in fact, we can start to include within our HTML page all sorts of JavaScript as well. So if I was to break out of if I was to break out of the way in which I'm working in here, so if I just break out of the server-side work for a moment, and inside here I put something that I thought was some client-side code, I could say script in here, and inside here I could say window.alert, and I could write out using current user display name, write out a message. So inside this, if I refresh my page, and we can see that that didn't actually work in the way that I wanted it to do, because why didn't it do that? Possibly it has written the code out, but not where I thought it was going to write it out. Yes, because it hasn't written it out in the way that I thought it was going to write it out. It wrote it out into a different place. That was rather silly of me. Instead, what I will do is I will put this into a string, and I will say crm.add content. So I'm adding it into the stream of the HTML that is written out within this page. So if I close that down and refresh this again, what we see is that we are able to use client-side JavaScript within the page that we're writing. Now, if we're using client-side JavaScript in the way that we're writing, we can use other things like, well, I've already used the current user object, haven't I? I did the current user just then, current user.user underscore display name. That's easy enough. We know that we're using Kylie Ward, and we can also use things like CRM.info message to say hello world. So look at the screen now, and you'll see that it says hello world. So we know that we can use client-side JavaScript in this case. It's not quite perfect, but for many things it is, and it's very useful. And importantly, if I type in Sage CRM, I've got access to some of the techniques to allow me to change the top content. So in here, I can say CSS top dot right to top div. This is now anything I want. So I can write now into the top part, into that top division, anything that I want to do to format this part of the page correctly. And that's something that I've actually discussed in some of the articles on using the client-side API to write into the top div. So have a look for that on the community. Now, the very last thing that I want to do is set the scene for the lesson that we're going to be discussing on Friday. Because on Friday, we're going to start moving towards complex screens. And in fact, that's what I want to do now. I would like to have a more complex version of the screen, which didn't just display one box saying the company summary, but I would like the address underneath. Now, the address information is easy enough. I can go into my screens and I can create a new Panoply address box. So there I can create a new address box, and in here I can add in the fields that I want. So let's add in the address, the city, the country, the email, the phone, and I could add in the postcode and all the other contact information as well that we have. So I've just rattled this information in here. Let's bring phone and email down to the bottom line, and I'll put phone and email onto a new line, and the address needs to be address and city with, I think, the state, with then the idea of the postcode on a new line, and then it'll be country, and then it will be on a new line phone and email address. So I've very simple. And of course we could improve the layout of these fields by changing and updating it, all the translations for those fields as well. But humour me on that. I've created a new structure here. I can take my structure now a little bit further. Get rid of that line. I've created one block in here for the Panoply details box. Now I'm going to copy this again and do some changing. So this is going to be my contacts block. This is going to be my address block. And where we've got the company summary, we'll have address written out as well, and this is going to be my address box. So we now have two blocks being pulled from metadata, and I need to introduce you to this idea of the within the code snippets of a container. A container really allows us to create structured table relationships between these areas of HTML. So it's using HTML tables to format the page. So it's not the most glamorous way of doing it. It's not the most sophisticated way of doing it, but nevertheless it does work, and we can format the structure of the page. So in here we look at our page, and I'm looking for this idea of a container block. Now what we see is the container block expects there to be contained within it, and the container here is a magic word. It's a way of instantiating a block without reference to metadata. So it's our first introduction to the idea that you can use all of the blocks, all of the screens, all of the lists, all of the field blocks without reference to metadata. So it's a pure programming environment as well. But here we are creating this, and this is going to be a very useful thing for us to be able to do. There's our container. The first block is going to be the idea of the company. I can't remember what I called it. The contact. No, I can't remember what I called my variable there. Contacts block. Contacts block is the variable, and this one is the address block. So I add in those two structures in here. We see that we can create communication between the two blocks. This is going to be a good idea for when we're dealing with the search block, but that doesn't make any sense here because we're just entering the information. What we can also see is that when we come to our idea of the container, we're going to be writing this out as that's the thing that's executed. But we notice how we've got the my record is passed to the one container, but then that record will be passed out to each of the blocks contained within the container. So it cascades down inside that. And we're still using the other information that we set up. So let's save that, and now when I refresh this page, we see that we've got a rather interesting arrangement where we've got a two-paneled page, which, if I click change, is editable, and we can see that it saves and allows us to carry on and work. So this is a nice page. We've got to a nice page where for some reason we've managed to lose the I think that's probably I need to log off and log back on again. That are panoply contacts, and then into here we should see I've gone and lost my coaching captions, but that's not the end of the world. But here we can have our company page and address. I have to investigate why that is. It's just a question of going back into my translations and resetting those, I think, but because I've been fiddling with the structure of the page, that's also one of the reasons. Let's see, have we got any questions? Coming back into coming back now to really where we can end the formal part of the course.